on soon. Gonna get tired of Gangnam Style in a little bit, and then they're gonna shift over. I did have to plug a YouTube channel. My boys at Dude Perfect. You should check them out. They're great. I love Dude Perfect. Oh, that's you like Dude Perfect? That's approved by Gerald?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, I wouldn't let my son watch him.
You wouldn't let your son watch Dude Perfect? Is it four Christian dudes doing strict sports shots?
It's too much. Like, too much noise. I don't want him chest bumping. You know what I'm saying? I don't know if we're live, but I just said that. Yeah, we are.
We're live. Okay. Well, it's still red over here, so.
It's red a lot.
So are we live?
Yeah, it's getting open now.
Welcome, no one, to this talk. Thank you for coming this evening. I'm really happy that some of you were able to brave the atrocious weather that we're having here, but at least it's not frozen or snowing. Thanks to Gerald for inviting me so that he could get out of his talk tonight. This is to follow up on Harrison Garlick's talk on Catholic voting last week, but I'm going to talk about a bigger set of ideas, I hope. Ideas that will hopefully help to contextualize things a little more. And I want to start with a quote by one of my favorite authors, G.K. Chesterton. A later legend, an afterthought but not an accident, said that stragglers from Troy founded a republic on the Italian shore. It was true in spirit that republican virtue had such a root, a mystery of honor that was not born in Babylon or out of Egyptian pride. There shone like the shield of Hector, defying Asia and Africa, till the light of a new day was loosened. With the rushing of the eagles and the coming of the name that came like a thunderclap when the world woke to Rome. Rome was founded, according to tradition, in 753 BC. A tiny city of mud huts set up on the Tiber River, 10 miles inland from the Mediterranean Sea. It was a city that has been of extreme importance for the last 2,500 plus years. So important that year, 753 BC, became, for the world, the year 1. 1 AUC. A system of dating that was so important that it continued to be used 6 centuries into the Christian era. So that in the martyrology that Catholics read on Christmas, it says, in the 753rd year after the foundation of the city of Rome, Christ was born. Rome was, and in a certain way remains, the fact of the world. Not just a religious fact, but a political fact, a legal fact, an ethical and moral fact. It was founded as a monarchy. In an act, like so many other foundings of cities, by original violence. 2 brothers, Romulus and Remus, quarreling over land, got into a fight, Romulus eventually killing him. It's the reason why we have the Roman Empire, not the Rheman Empire. Romulus becomes the first king. He sets up a state. He founds a senate, a body of patrician fathers, the patres of the clans. But what the Senate's job is to do under the monarchy is simply to select the new king. The new king then is invested with full executive, legislative, and judicial power. Romulus reigns for a long time. He's a warlike king. And in the end, he's not very popular. He begins to act in a very high-handed way. So the great Roman historian Livy writes about his demise. He says that at the end of his life, in front of his army, Romulus was taken up to heaven in a storm. Of course, there are also some that say, he tells us matter-of-factly, that think that senators took him behind the stage and stabbed him. So you can choose either of one of those to believe, a violent beginning and a violent end, and such is often the story of those who hold absolute power. For 250 years, the kings reigned, some good, some bad, but increasingly tending toward the latter. In the year 509, the king's son, was a man named Tarquin. Tarquin was out doing what Romans do, fighting the various hill cities and villages that surrounded their city, their very tiny city at this time. And they were sitting around the campfire one night. And they were having an argument, like men do, about whose wife was the most virtuous. What do you think I was going to say? And just the fact that they were having this argument tells us a lot about Rome. They were having an argument about whose wife was the most virtuous, and everyone was claiming that their wife was the most virtuous. Shows us what the Romans valued. And so they said the only way we could settle an argument like this is by riding back to Rome in the middle of the night and checking. And so one's wife was asleep, another's wife was off partying with friends, but the wife of one Collatinus, his name was Lucretia, was at her home, late into the night, spinning her wool, managing her household, taking care of everything that needed to be done in the absence of her husband. Lucretia was acclaimed as the most virtuous of Roman women. But the king's son, Tarquin, seeing her, conceived in his heart a lust. And so he decided that after they rode back to the camp and everybody went to bed, he alone would ride back to the city. He knocks on the door. Lucretia comes to the door with a lantern. It's the king's son. What are you going to do? She gives him hospitality. And then, when the whole household is abed, he creeps into her room, puts a sword to her neck, and says, "You must sleep with me." And she says, "Absolutely not. I'm faithful to my husband." Romans valued family life and marital chastity extremely highly. He said, "You're going to sleep with me, or I'll sleep with you anyway, then kill you. Then kill one of your slaves and put his body beside you, so everyone will think that I caught you two in flagrante delicto. And I'll be the hero, and your name will be stained forever." And so, given this intolerable choice, she sleeps with him. She then sends a message to her father and to her husband at the front, and they arrive with their friend, whose name was Lucius Junius Brutus. She lets them in the house. She calmly explains what had happened. They're of course shocked, but they tell her, "This is not your fault. There's nothing that you did wrong. We're going to take care of this." But in the midst of this, after she calmly tells her story, she takes out a dagger and says, "Never will anyone use the name of Lucretia as an excuse for unchastity." And she plunges her sword into her chest. Now, her father and her husband are absolutely shocked at this. They're floored. They can't do anything. But Lucius Junius Brutus has seen all this, and he says, "We have got to let the people of Rome know what kind of tyrants the royal family has become." And so he gathers all of the Romans together into the forum, and he tells them what happened to this virtuous woman. Everyone there spontaneously swears an oath: eternal hatred for monarchy. We will never have a king in Rome. And so they drive the Tarquins out. The monarchy ends in the year 509, and that's the foundation of the Republic. Power passes into the hands of the Senate. Monarchy turns into tyranny. The Senate, being the most senior members of the noble houses of Rome, begins to take control. And as time goes on, that aristocracy begins to turn into an oligarchy. Instead of one tyrant, there's 100 tyrants. And so the people of Rome, the lower classes of Rome, say, "We are Roman citizens as well. We share the same values that you do. We fight in the same wars. Just because you have these lineages descended from Romulus doesn't mean that you can treat us as if we were foreigners or as if we were subhuman. And so you've got to give us some form of representation." Now, in seeking what form of government to have, the Romans had sent envoys around the Mediterranean world. They had seen the Asiatic despotism of places like Egypt and Persia, and they said they didn't want that. They'd had their own experiences of tyranny. And then they went to Greece, and they saw the city-states which one of only 2 experiments in pure democracy in all of history. And those city-states had repulsed the Persian Empire. They preserved Greek culture. But in a very short time, those city-states were going to themselves turn into military bullies, particularly the city-state of Athens. It was the democratic city-state that would put Socrates to death in a form of judicial murder. For the Romans had seen that another name for democracy is a lynch mob. A pure democracy is nothing other than a lynch mob, something which the American founders would later call the tyranny of the majority. How then to create a government that is going to be able to survive the deterioration of all 3 types of government? And so what they said, what we need is a mixed regime. We need to retain the best elements of all 3 while avoiding the pitfalls. And so what they did is the lower classes set up assemblies. But these assemblies could only discuss decrees of the Senate. They could only propose measures. The Senate still had to pass on them. So about 50 years after the founding of the Republic in 509, they created a new office because the threat of civil war was so great. The lower classes needed representation. And so what they did was set up a new office called the tribune. The tribunes were 10 lower class members elected from the assemblies and sent to the Senate. The tribunes had no vote in the Senate. The tribunes could not even speak in the Senate. Doesn't sound like much power, right? But what they could do is any one of the 10 tribunes could veto any legislation that was prejudicial to the commons. And this was a massive power. And so it forced the Senate to take into account the needs of the lower classes while maintaining the aristocratic element in government. This Roman system endured, this constitution, this mixed constitution, endured for 500 years until a series of events led to its breakdown. We can talk about that in a little bit. So the main idea of Roman constitutionalism is the sharing and distribution of power. The great enemy is the concentration of power in the hands of any one group. In order to eliminate the tendency for power corruption, you want to give a certain amount of authority to each level. Now, the Romans knew that one of the weaknesses of the democratic system was that its executive power was not strong. All right? You had massive representation, but the question was, what kind of executive did you have to put those laws into effect? Now, they didn't want a king, and so what they did in order to limit power, they decided they would have executive officers, in fact, 2 executive officers called consuls. They were so afraid of the concentration of power that they divided the executive power into 2. These consuls were elected only for 1-year periods, and when they were elected, they couldn't be re-elected for 5 years. The Romans are terrified of the concentration of power. And so, you have a Roman executive, you have a Roman legislative combined between the tribunes and the Senate, and the judicial functions controlled by the Senate as well. That means that the main task of governing falls on the upper class. It still falls on the aristocrats, even though they have to consult and defer to the executive power of the consuls, at least in a limited way. So how did they make this system work? They had an ideal of public service that was absolutely astonishing. The aristocrats, because of their wealth, were expected to give unremunerated public service for no fewer than 25 years of their life. From the time that they were 20 to the time that they were 55, they were expected to be an unpaid public service, a series of offices wherein they learned all of the different ways that a city was run, that an army was run, that a nation was run. And they did this all without any sort of monetary remuneration. This course of honors, as it was called, mixed military experience, political experience, civil experience, till finally, at the age of 40, they could be elected to the Senate and be appointed consuls. Now, there was one further office that's kind of important to talk about. The Romans were a military people. They never stopped being a military people. During the period of the Republic, 500 years, they were only at peace for 50 of those. It was mostly because other nations were attacking them, at least at first. And so being a military people, they knew one thing, that battles are not won by committees. All right, you don't want to have a board meeting when you're about to engage in battle. What you want is a leader. And so they had a relief valve called a dictator. When the dictator was appointed, he took the power of the consuls, the Senate, the tribunes, and the assembly together. This happened only in times of extreme national crisis. When the enemy was at the gate, they would appoint a dictator. Well, what about their worry about the concentration of power? The dictator has absolute power of life or death over political and military matters for 6 months. If a dictator tries to overstay his term by 1 day, any Roman of any class has the right to strike him dead on the spot. This is a people worried about the concentration of power, but at the same time, a practical people able to create a flexible system that is able not only to survive, but to thrive and to provide a model for the rest of history. But there were further, deeper things that made the Roman system work. The Romans were a people of law, of written law, where judgments were rendered in just ways, whether you were poor or whether you were rich. As the great Roman legist Cicero says, justice is giving to each what is their due, rendering to each what is their due. And that will become important for later. The Romans had an exalted idea of citizenship. Everyone in the city of Rome, rich or poor, was a Roman citizen and entitled to the benefit of law, entitled to the benefit of justice. They had a deep idea of public service, as I've just said. They had an education that inculcated these values, a constitution that maintained them, but particularly they had a family life that cultivated them. Particularly significant were the practice of the virtues. The Greeks had been the one who theoretically worked out the cardinal virtues of prudence, justice, temperance, and fortitude. The Romans weren't quite as original as the Greeks. They were practical people. They were farmers. They were soldiers. They were lawyers. But they put the virtues into practice a lot better than the Greeks did. Some of you may have heard my phrase that I think is pretty apt. The Romans practiced what the Greeks preached. And for that reason, they were successful and eventually conquered not only the Greeks, but also the entirety of the Mediterranean basin, far beyond. The most important virtue for this was piety. And it's not just about pumpkin pie piety. It's about the kind of obligations that you owe to others for having given things to you. It's a type of justice. It's a species of justice, as Thomas would say. The Romans were experts at piety. Once, when the Etruscans were invading the city, Rome was constantly under the threat of invasion, had many brave and upright soldiers. There was one bridge leading into the city. If the Etruscans crossed this bridge, then the city would be lost and the story of Rome would be over. But as happened over and over again, someone stood up from the crowd. Then out spake brave Horatius, the captain of the guard. To every man upon this earth, death cometh soon or late. And how can man die better than facing fearful odds? For the ashes of his fathers and the temples of his gods. that poem from the 1820s by Macaulay, encapsulates this Roman idea of piety. I will stand and fight for my country and defend my city. Why? Because it is my land that was given to me by generations who had come before me, who acted brave in their time. And it is the site of my religion, my religious obligations, my gods whom I worship. Just to close this section on Rome, I want to go back to Chesterton. And this is important for any nation, any society at any time. Chesterton says, men did not love Rome because she was great. Rome was great because men loved her. Now, if we can fast forward, we only have a certain amount of time, about 2,000 years, to the founding generation of America, 1776. They were faced, in many senses, with the same question that Lucius Junius Brutus faced in 509. We have overthrown a monarchy which was considered tyrannical. And so the question is, what kind of constitution are we going to create? They knew their history. These were extremely well-educated people. They had read Livy, they had read Socrates. They knew that the pure democracy of the Greeks was not wanted. But nor could they have the kind of aristocracy that was present in so many European countries. America had a rough equality among all the people that were in it. And so, looking back at the Romans, they said this mixed constitution, a separation of powers, a system of checks and balances to limit the concentration of power in the hands of a few, whether it be a strong man or whether it be an oligarchy or whether it be a scheme of business interests. There must be a distribution of power if one is to have a balanced republic. And in order to maintain a balanced republic, republican virtue is needed. Therefore, they presumed, like the ancient Romans did, the necessity of education and virtue. This is what John Adams said, the second president. We have no government armed with power capable of contending with human passions, unbridled by morality and religion. Avarice, ambition, revenge, or gallantry would break the strongest cords of our Constitution as a whale goes through a net. Our Constitution was made only for immoral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other. And so the key here is a training in the virtues. It was considered to be absolutely mandatory, both by the ancient Romans and by the American founding generation. And so that leads to a question then, that in the American system, just to finish the chart, the executive was maintained in the office of the president. They were less worried than the Romans about the concentration of power in the hands of a unitary executive. They wanted to limit the power of the executive by election every 4 years. They also limited the power of the president by making sure that the president was a civilian and not a member of the military. That was really the danger in the 18th century. Notice that when Eisenhower ran for president in the 1950s, he had to resign from the army first before he could take office politically in the United States. They maintained the Senate, and if you know Latin, Senate simply comes from the word for a group of old men. So it's pretty clear that the more things change, the more they stay the same. The democratic element was the House, each of the three balancing the other. The president, the unitary executive, I didn't mean to say that, that's a constitutionally charged term, but a single executive is what I meant. The Senate, representing the interests of the states, and the House, representing the interests of all of the people together. In the original plan of the Constitution, only the House was proportionally elected by the people. The Senate was selected by the legislatures of the states and continued to be so until 1912. And the president was elected based on apportionment through the Electoral College, which is a system that we still have. So all of this was meant to mimic the strengths of the Roman system, to give representation to the whole, to give representation to constituent states, and to make sure there was unity of leadership and execution, all limited by appointment and election. And so they're concerned about the separation of powers, or about the limitation of powers as well. How does Rome and piety and the American Constitution really all come together for us today? There's a word that's been used and misused and abused by many on all sides of the political equation, and that is patriotism. I think the question is patriotism even possible today? Can we be patriots, particularly in a society marked by massive political strife and almost intractable ideological opposition? Patriotism refers to the society or the nation as a whole. Given the events of the last year, can we give deference to a society that has sinned in the past and whose legacy continues to haunt us in the present? Well, in order to do that, we need to have a definition and a distinction. And all of you who've taken my classes know those are my two favorite things. We have to have clear definitions and we have to have solid distinctions. And so I want to look at Thomas Aquinas. He's a good person to turn to in many of these questions. He says patriotism is a species of piety. Piety is a species of justice, that which we owe to one another. Now there is commutative justice, that which we owe to one another, that giving each person their due. But there's a certain justice we owe to those that involves a debt that we can never repay. A debt that is so great that it can't just be giving somebody, what we owe them. If I have a bill for $10, I have to pay that bill. This is a bill that can never be repaid. And so this is what St. Thomas says. He says, man becomes a debtor to other men in various ways, according to their various excellence and the various benefits received from them. And on both counts, he says, God holds first place. Literally everything is received from God, and there's no way that anyone could ever make any sort of recompense for what they received. Not only life, but sensation and reason and free will, anthropic principle that allows us to live on this planet at this time. All of this is utterly gratuitous. Nothing that we gave ourselves. And so we owe an infinite debt to God. Now, of course, given our limitations, we cannot pay that infinite debt. But that doesn't mean it's not still owed. And so that's the top level of piety, that which is owed to God. And that comes under the special virtue called religion. And this is religion in the natural sense, the natural virtue, rendering to God that which is his due, independent of any sort of religious commitments. Right? What is owed to God simply is the origin of all things, is the first mover, even, basically. On the second place, Thomas continues, the principles of our being in government are our parents and our country. They have given us birth, nourishment, and education. Consequently, after God, we are debtors to our parents and our nation. Just as it belongs to religion to give worship to God, so does it belong to piety, in the second place, to give honor to one's parents and one's country. And so there's the sort of an old patriotic saw, God, family, and country. Thomas doesn't include guns there for some reason. But God, family, and country in that order. These are the groups to which we owe an unpayable debt. We received life from our parents. If that's all we received from our parents, if our fathers disappeared the moment that we were conceived, we would still owe an unpayable debt. This comes from Cicero and Aristotle. And the same, in a certain sense, to our country. Socrates refused even to run away from what everyone knew was an unjust judgment. Because he says, look, I've lived here 70 years. I've enjoyed the benefit of my country's laws. I've enjoyed the benefit of my country's protection. I've served in the military in order to defend it. I have taken justice from the law courts. I've taken education. I've been reared in its confines. I've taken every single benefit my country has to offer. I can't abandon it now simply because I think I've been treated badly. And so Socrates voluntarily, in a certain sense, lays down his life as a debt of payment to his country. He could have left any time. Lived 70 years, never traveled. He said, I could have left Athens. No one was forcing me to stay here. In a more religious sense, in a more Christian sense, there are certain rules that govern Christians' relations to the government. The first is the famous phrase of Christ when asked, the Pharisees were trying to trap him about the coin. And he said, is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar? And Christ in reply says, whose image is on that? And they say, Caesar's. Well then, give to Caesar's those things which are Caesar's, and give to God those things which are God's. And as a distinction in the realm of piety, things are owed to God and things are owed to Caesar. When he says, give to things, render unto Caesar those things that are Caesar's, that implies that there are certain things that we owe to Caesar, even if the ruler is a pagan, even if the ruler, in some cases, is unjust. Another important passage is Romans 13. That says, all power comes from God. Obey the princes who are the terrors to evildoers. They do not bear the sword in vain. Paul is writing this about a pagan Roman Empire that in certain cases is persecuting his own co-religionists. That Caesar, or Pilate for that matter, would have no power unless it were permitted by God. And this is kind of a sobering thought. This means that in a certain sense, from a Christian perspective, Donald Trump holds power from God. And perhaps on January 20th, Joe Biden is going to hold power from God. Whether we like it or not. Even though we do the electing, the power is still conferred by God. Christianity was never a religion of political revolution. And these two passages make it pretty clear. You're supposed to be obedient to the authorities. Now, obedience in those things which do not detract from the two higher things. If there is a law of country that conflicts with what's due to the family or what's due to God, those are by nature unjust and must be resisted. But in the things which are purely within the purview of the country, which includes paying taxes, which includes obeying the civil laws that are put there for our safety, which includes, and I know this is going to be unpopular, speed limits. All of these are just laws, laws that we're bound to obey. Catholics in particular have always lived rather patriotically in American history. Catholics have died in numbers well in excess of their portion of the population in America's wars. In World War I, 19% of the population was Catholic, 40% of the casualties were Catholic. Catholics historically have joined the military in exceptionally high numbers. But to return to Aristotle, if patriotism is a virtue, if piety towards one's country is a virtue, that must mean that there are opposed vices. That there are vices which deform patriotism on both sides of it. On one side would be the exaltation of the country over the family or God. This is particularly present, that we've seen in the 20th century, in nationalism. G.K. Chesterton says, to say my nation, right or wrong, is like saying my mother, drunk or sober. A patriot will oppose their country when that country is doing wrong. A patriot will say that this or that action is unjust. When Chesterton was accused of lack of patriotism when he opposed Britain's participation in the Boer War in South Africa, he said, "I'm not opposing the war because I'm unpatriotic. I oppose the war because I love my country." Nationalism sees nation as the highest value. And what in the end it means is the destruction of the individual. And as we can see in places where communism or fascism takes control, the destruction of all subordinate societies, like the family, but also those intermediate bodies which mediate between the individual and the power of the state. It's no mistake that Hitler, when he was seizing power in Germany, attacked groups like the Boy Scouts and the Girl Scouts and private Catholic schools. Why? Because these were intermediate sources of allegiance that could prevent his exercise of total power. Those intermediate institutions protect us from the application of absolute tyranny. And this is a caution to individualists. Once you have torn down all of those intermediate groups and exalted the sovereign individual, and all that's left is you and the tyrant, when the all-seeing eye of Sauron turns on you, there's going to be nothing to hide behind. And this sort of nationalism can happen on the right or the left. It is, as so many vices are, a disordering of right order. Right? Hitler and Stalin wanted to abolish religion. Many communist theorists have wanted to abolish the family. The family is a bourgeois institution. And so nationalism, particularly in the 20th century, has been a temptation to disorder patriotism. But on the other side, and this perhaps maybe comes closer to our to our present situation, on the other side of patriotism are the vices of strife and sedition. It is a constant teaching of Catholic social teaching that we must respect private property. Just because you think you are not paid enough does not justify your raiding the cash register, Robin Hood. We must respect peace and order. Christians are not political revolutionaries. Even if we believe there is systemic injustice, that does not dissolve our obligations to obey just laws. If I happen to think laws against abortion are wrong, that doesn't mean I get to speed. Just laws are just laws. Laws protecting property, laws protecting people, laws establishing public order. These are just laws in any society. And in fact, the greatest achievements of the 20th century in terms of social justice have come from collective nonviolence. Collective nonviolent action. Look at Gandhi and the salt strikes in India. Look at Martin Luther King. Look at the sit-ins at the counters in the South. The greatest achievements in social justice have come not from the advancement of violence, like the French Revolution or the Communist Revolution. They've come from nonviolence. All nations are imperfect. All have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. Societies, no less than individuals. There is no perfect society on earth, and there never will be a perfect society on earth. Even when Christians were persecuted by the Roman state, they remained good citizens. Tertullian, writing in the year 200, writes to the emperor who is persecuting them and says, look at how we're good citizens. We honor contracts, we pray for the emperor, we have people that are serving with distinction in the Roman legions, we pay our taxes, we honor our bargains. Even when persecuted by an unjust regime, Tertullian maintains the good of citizenship. All nations have done evil. Britain killed and persecuted hundreds of Catholic priests over the course of several centuries. Indeed, Britain caused the death of tens of thousands of Irish Catholics by their actions during the Irish potato famine. Yet, today, there are patriotic British Catholics. They know that all societies are imperfect, and they have striven for the improvement and have achieved, if you look at the course of British history in the last 200 years, achieved a significant amount of improvement. For instance, the legal and peaceful abolition of slavery. If you haven't seen that movie, Amazing Grace, I hope you watch it. In spite of their faults, we still love our parents. We still ought to love our parents. As we grow older, we see more faults in our parents. But that doesn't mean that we attack them. But particularly in the case of the United States, just to wrap up, there really has never been a more audacious and balanced attempt to secure the blessings of liberty to such a great amount of people. While America is imperfect, and particularly for the citizen, our citizenship in it only transitory, there is still some truth to the old Puritan concept of America as a city set on a hill. Indeed, what I would encourage, and what I hope once the pandemic is over, is to spend a quiet hour in the cemeteries of Italy and Normandy, between the crosses, row on row, where thousands of Americans lie buried and entombed halfway across the world because they would not permit injustice to continue. There might still be something to be patriotic about. Thanks very much. Have a good night. Any questions? Comments? Thanks everybody online for tuning in. Anybody watching online? 3 people. All right, excellent. Thank you, all you 3 people, for braving the weather and watching us on YouTube. All right, everybody have a great night. I'll see some of you in class tomorrow. I really enjoyed coming. Thanks for the